It is estimated most human beings only use 10% of their brain's capacity. Imagine if we could access 100%. Interesting things begin to...
That movie treated the audience like they were really, really stupid. Probably a criticism you've heard before, but what does it really mean? And by contrast, what does the opposite look like? How does a movie treat the audience like they're smart? Well, I think there's a few ways to answer this question, but I think the biggest factor that really shows how dumb or smart a movie thinks you are as a viewer is how it handles exposition. A quick refresher on the subject in case you're rusty: exposition is a narrative device that writers use to convey important information about the story to the audience. This information is usually things like character backgrounds, rules or facts about the world that the story takes place in, or major events preceding the beginning of the story. This stuff is all obviously pretty integral to the plot, so it's really important that it's conveyed clearly and thoroughly. But in order to make a story convincing, and probably what most people would just consider to be better, it should also be done subtly. This is really where the criticism that this video is about comes from. How is this integral information presented to the audience? And was that process subtle or painfully obvious? Did they beat you over the head with this information or let you connect the dots yourself? If their method of doing so is too obvious, it can come off as patronizing to the viewer. When the expositional bits are trying to hold your hand through the process of explaining things to make sure you really get it, that's annoying. On the other side of the spectrum are movies that are confident enough in their ability to hold our attention, as well as our ability to infer things on our own. That way they can give us exposition that doesn't have to be repeated 100 times, or better yet, just demonstrated to us. I've got a few examples of really bad and really good exposition in movies. In other words, here are a few movies that treat you like an idiot, and here are some other movies that treat you like you're a competent human being. Most of these trailer clips that I've been playing so far are from 2014's Lucy, starring Scarlett Johansson and Morgan Freeman. This movie has lots of dumb parts in it and is honestly just mostly dumb, but where it really starts to treat the viewers like they're dumb is with the inclusion of Morgan Freeman's character, who's like a professor scientist or something. But as you heard from the beginning, this movie is about the old myth that humans only use 10% of their brains. And allegedly, if we could unlock the other 90%, we'd somehow turn into these telepathic, telekinetic demigods. In the right hands, maybe the story could be interesting, but personally, I just kind of saw it as another forgettable action hero movie. But Morgan Freeman's expositional character is the reason why I'm using this as an example. There are plenty of examples of characters in movies that are purely expositional, and that's usually fine. It's used because it works. So I'm not just going to rip on expositional characters. Moira McTaggart from the new X-Men trilogy was actually born with the mutant ability of exposition. If you can create these kinds of characters in a nuanced way that makes them believable, it can actually be a great way to disguise exposition. Disguising exposition is usually what writers attempt to do with their stories. That way it doesn't break our sense of immersion, and we don't even realize that we're being fed information about these characters or the universe that they inhabit. If they don't want to disguise exposition, they can go ahead and throw in an opening narration.
It began with the forging of the Great Rings.
Montage, or literally just write it out for us to read. And that's okay too. Sometimes it can be lazy, but every once in a while it ends up being iconic. But I'm getting off track. Lucy treats the audience like they're stupid in the same fashion as many other films, with an expositional character that is no effort put into writing their dialogue. I mainly just picked this movie as an example because there's a scene in this movie where Morgan Freeman is literally just showing a PowerPoint presentation about Lucy's powers and how we use our brain. And as if that scene doesn't sound painful enough on its own, like, look at this. What are they doing here? He's showing the classroom these slides of what he's talking about, but in case we really don't get it, the movie keeps cutting away from his presentation and whatever's happening to these random stock footage shots. This doesn't make any sense. He says bad environments and it shows bad environments. He says good environments and it shows good environments. And then it shows animals having sex. Then these people having sex. And then, oh my god. Why? But anyway, I want to keep harping on disguising exposition a little more before moving on to more examples. Because you don't necessarily have to wrap it up in one character that just knows everything and has to explain it to everyone. The version of this that I see most commonly, maybe a bit too commonly, is everyone knows everything about the universe except for the main character. That way it's okay for him to constantly be asking stupid questions and everyone can fill him in, and we as the viewer who don't know anything can relate to him. Writing convincing and interesting exposition is really difficult. Having an ignorant protagonist is an easy solution to have characters explain things to him, but you still have to do so in a way that feels natural. And this goes for any expositional dialogue between characters.
Oh, what would Mom and Dad say?
I don't know. They're gone. They died when I was 3, remember?
See? People don't talk like that. He literally just asked his brother, hey, remember when Mom and Dad died? Yes. Yes, I do. And I also remember that they didn't love you, you freakish sociopath. ... Dialogue like this is used all the time, maybe not always so heavy-handed, but conversations like this are written to cue in the audience about important information. In this case, that the protagonist's parents are no longer around. Even though that's never the way anyone would say that. Talk about death in a normal way and it's fine. It also doesn't really feel natural or the least bit convincing when you have an astronaut explaining things to another astronaut that an astronaut should know. What, they didn't teach you this before putting you in space? Here, let me show you.
A circle. What's a circle in 3 dimensions? Sphere.
Yes, Matthew McConaughey, you are correct. It is a sphere.
I am the smartest man alive!
So if you take the time to think about it, you can probably come up with tons of ways that expositional dialogue or information has been slipped into your favorite movies, whether done subtly or forced. And for the record, Big Hero 6 is not one of the examples of movies that I think treat the audience like they're stupid. I just used that clip because I think it is honestly the most on-the-nose and horribly written expository line that I can think of off the top of my head. Interstellar doesn't really qualify either. It's just easy to pick on because Nolan is always trying to lay the foundation for really complex ideas, even though most of them end up creating plot holes anyway. I'm definitely not the first to make fun of that scene in particular, or a lot of its other interesting choices in dialogue. But with all those things in mind, I'll move on to what I think is probably the most egregious example of a movie that has absolutely no faith in its audience's intelligence or sense of agency. I know. Really? He's gonna rip on Suicide Squad? Everyone tore it to shreds last year when it came out. I don't need to hear more of this. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I know this is low-hanging fruit at this point, but I promise I'm only going to point out the scenes where this movie appears to be actively mocking your intelligence. Even though the scene I want to talk about in particular has already been pretty thoroughly picked apart by Folding Ideas' review of the movie that is over 1 million views. Link to that in description. But Folding Ideas' review chalks this scene, as well as most of the movie's other shortcomings, to editing problems. And while I agree, especially after watching his video, that Suicide Squad suffers from major editing issues, I really think that this scene in the movie's biggest offense is its unashamed pandering exposition. So here we go. Before getting into that final scene, the movie starts us off with these little profiles of each character and their background. A pretty easy to recognize example of exposition, but not necessarily bad yet. Although these are pretty rapid fire, and for me at least a little too fast to read at a comfortable pace, I don't think these bios are a horrible addition to the movie. Where it ends up being bad is when the only backstory or information we get on some of these characters is in this montage of Viola Davis just talking about them and why we should think that they're cool. Like, what do we know about Killer Croc from this movie? This? That was like 2 seconds, and all it says is that he wrestled and eats people. Do we learn anything about him at all after that? Deadshot and Harley Quinn are really the only two who get any sort of expositional attention through some flashbacks and stuff. Then we get Slipknot, who doesn't get a bio at all. He just gets this one line for all of his exposition.
Here comes Slipknot, the man who can climb anything. Wonderful.
Which I guess is understandable when your superpower is ropes. But hey, that one line should be enough to establish an emotional connection to the character so that we can care about him through all his conflict and... Oh. Yeah, no one saw that coming. An even better example of one-line exposition.
This is Katana. She's got my back. She can cut all you in half with one sword stroke, just like mowing the lawn. I would advise not getting killed by her. Her sword traps the souls of its victims.
Thank you, Rick Flag. The most interesting character of them all, everyone. This white guy in camo. Couldn't have imagined that line being said any better. But it's this scene at the climax that really drives home just how little confidence Suicide Squad has in the audience's ability to understand literally anything at all. Let's go back and examine all the exposition this movie has given us about the antagonist, if you can even really call her that. Viola Davis's character introduces us to most of the characters at this dinner scene, and one of the only things she tells us about the Enchantress is...
So we searched the cave where she turns up, and we found her heart.
That thing's her heart?
She's vulnerable without it.
Got it. Okay, sounds good. Secret buried heart that can control one of the most powerful metahumans you've ever encountered. Probably important. I'll remember it. Then we get to see that same heart in a box strapped to a bomb. Even better. Now we've seen that Davis is in possession of the heart. We even see her demonstrate how to use it to exercise control over the Enchantress. Not bad exposition so far. Later, we see her use this power again, this time to try and kill Enchantress. At this point, we're past exposition because we've clearly been told and shown the capabilities of this plot device. Based on what we know about it, everything here makes sense because it's been established. The heart belongs to this demon lady, you stab it, she gets hurt. So when we see it happen again here, it's easy to follow. Great. Everything is just dandy. Well, I mean, this part anyway. The rest of this movie outside that one plot device is an absolute train wreck. Then, Enchantress gets her heart back. which as we all know from the scenes leading up to this means that Amanda Waller no longer has any control over the Enchantress, which probably makes her more dangerous. This effectively raises the stakes for the final act of the film, and we get some dramatic tension. Sweet. And just as a constant reminder to make extra sure the audience still remembers that heart thing might be important, they give Cara Delevingne a CGI glowing heart that is clearly visible through her chest at all times. You can probably see where this is going. But just in case, and this is probably where it starts to come off a little condescending from the screenwriters to the viewers, Rick Flag gives us this detailed military plan of attack to his team that could only have been devised by a true master tactician such as himself.
We gotta cut her heart out!
Going back to the Folding Ideas review and the editing problems of Suicide Squad, he and I, as well as probably everyone else, have the same issue with this point of the climax. Even though he talks about it as an editing issue, which I totally agree with, I personally think it's more of a writing problem. But the way he sets up talking about this one part in particular is probably about as well articulated as it possibly could have been. So I'm just gonna let him do that.
This is, at this point, incredibly well established. It's the single best established rule of the film's fiction. If there were anything in this movie that you could feel 100% confident trusting the audience to follow along with in a chaotic moment, this is it. The Enchantress's weakness is her heart. And then this happens.
You mess with my friends!
Her heart's out! We can end this!
This is me slow clapping. I'm slow clapping for Rick Flag. Man. This scene. They established one thing really well. And in the climax, what is meant to be the most exciting part of the entire movie, they kill all their momentum so that this garbage character can remind everyone yet again of the one thing that they are almost guaranteed to understand about the narrative. He might as well have looked into the camera instead of at Will Smith to break the fourth wall and just say it directly to the people watching. Just turn this into a Ferris Bueller parody at this point, because there's no other way of explaining this scene without the studio, screenwriters, and producers having to openly acknowledge and admit that they included that line and kept it in the final cut of the film even after a ridiculous amount of reshoots, because they honestly thought that people watching this movie might not be capable of following along otherwise. This is why people say movies can treat you like you're stupid, and this scene might just be the most glaring example of what that looks like. Whew, that was a lot of negativity. But I really do think that one takes the cake for lack of respect for its audience. If you have an example of a movie or scene that you think is worse, please leave it in the comments. My morbid curiosity eagerly awaits a potentially worse clip than this. But let's move on to the positive. Movies that have the decency to assume that you're a functioning adult. Man, so many. Really, any movie that disguises its exposition in an original or creative way could fall into this category. Here's some of my favorite examples. Inglourious Basterds. Starting with Christoph Waltz's character, we're given a lengthy description of his accomplishments and backstory. Normally something like this would be pretty boring and just bad because it's not how people introduce themselves in real life. And as we saw earlier, having people talk in a way that doesn't seem realistic is a great way to remind the audience that we're watching actors reciting lines instead of real people. But Tarantino does a couple things unconventionally. For one, the way he writes his dialogue is pretty well known at this point to be very stylized. It doesn't have the realism of normal conversation, but it's extremely entertaining to listen to. If you're familiar with his movies, you know what I'm talking about. Tarantino has a way with words that's almost as beautiful as Rick Flag's. Secondly, and this isn't super original, but definitely more rare, we have another character introduce Waltz. Hans Landa asks his host if he's heard rumors about his reputation, and then we're treated with a backstory that doesn't feel forced because it's just a man reciting
only rumors.
Only rumors. But Hans Landa isn't the only great character intro we get, which is why this movie makes it onto my list. We have the drawn-out, ominous introduction of the Bear Jew, Brad Pitt's introductory monologue to the Bastards, and of course... The Social Network. Directed by David Fincher and written by Aaron Sorkin, these two are masterful storytellers, and putting them together is an absolute dream team. In their years of experience in writing, it's no wonder that the exposition seems so non-existent and that the dialogue is so engaging. The opening scene in particular is such a seemingly normal and innocuous conversation between two people that if you're not actively looking for the expository dialogue, you probably won't even notice how much you learn about our protagonist in those first 5 minutes. And can we just appreciate that when having a conversation in a club, they're actually shouting?
What? She's done for the summer, so she's back at her parents' place.
This detail is overlooked in like every other movie that has a club scene.
Not bad. It's better than not bad. You ain't see it turn around yet. What are you calling her, a 7? That's an 8. At least an 8. That is not it.
How can you hear each other at a normal speaking level? What club anywhere on earth doesn't have music that's so loud you have to scream in people's ear just to talk to them? Obviously, it'd be pretty hard for a mic to pick up actors' lines in an actual club setting. That meant Eisenberg and Timberlake had to act like it was loud when it really sounded like this.
Rehearsing! Oh yeah. Playback!
Once again, I'm off the topic of exposition, but this is just so good. Jurassic Park. It's a cute little cartoon, what's not to like? Take note, Lucy, if you want to have instructions taught to your audience, make it more like this. This is fun, this is interesting, and it's actually for the characters in the movie and not just the people watching it. Pretty much everything by Wes Anderson. Also a very stylistic director who usually has pretty blatant bits of exposition, but he does so in a way that's usually funny or just really pretty to look at.
Margot Tenenbaum was adopted at age 2. Her father had always noted this when introducing her.
There Will Be Blood. This movie is just brilliant, but the exposition on Daniel Day-Lewis's character is completely engrossing. With no opening text other than the title, we fade in on this tense music in the desert. Cut to Daniel Plainview with a pickaxe in a cave. We're not told who he is, what he's doing, or anything else. In fact, for the next almost 6 full minutes, there's no dialogue whatsoever in this same location, and this silence is captivating. 6 minutes might not sound like a super long time, but 6 minutes with 0 talking is pretty uncomfortable. And we're just watching this guy go about mining stuff. Feels like we're in silence with this character for forever, and all we have to go off of is this uneasy feeling we get from the quick bit of music. The fact that we get so much exposition in this scene with no talking and no text except for a date popping up is mind-blowing. We learn that this character is mining for something valuable, and he has the tools and resources to find whatever it is. He's doing so alone, which we come to find out is pretty dangerous, but he had to have known that going into this, and he chose to do so anyway. Is he reclusive, reckless, doesn't like sharing? We don't know yet, but we do know he's extremely determined and tough as nails. He pulls himself out, not before grabbing a bit of whatever it is he came for, and drags himself God knows how far to civilization with a broken leg. He cashes in a bit of what appears to be silver, still with no talking, and then jumps right into 1902. Now he's got more equipment and is probably more determined than ever. Work conditions still looking tough, but he's got help now. Judging from what we've already learned in the same sequence, he probably only has these people around because they add enough value for him that he can afford to have the help. He'd be doing so alone if he could. He's sketching blueprints. If he's capable of designing a structure like that, he's got to be smart. We see his great parenting skills. Finally, at the 12-minute mark, we hear the first bit of speaking in the whole movie. It's Daniel Day-Lewis monologuing, and he's showing us that he's a well-spoken and professional businessman. By the time he introduces his son, we've already witnessed their relationship start in complete silence, but this added bit of exposition flows effortlessly. He's a family man, he refers to his son as his partner, and essentially uses him as a marketing tactic, further showing us his cunning as a businessman. This movie is just incredible. Just go watch it if you haven't seen it. And finally, what I would probably have to say is my absolute favorite movie, Jeremy Saulnier's Green Room. I'm saving this one for last because there are probably going to have to be some minor spoilers. I'll do my best to keep those points that I talk about vague and not get too specific, but if you want to go into your first viewing completely blind, you might want to skip ahead when I post the time. And like I said, this is my favorite movie, so I'd hate to ruin the experience for anyone. If you are going to watch it, you might also want to hear this quick disclaimer. It's graphic. As far as my personal taste in movies is concerned, if you haven't picked up on this already, I'm a big fan of Tarantino and David Fincher in particular. One thing that those guys have in common is graphic, R-rated violence in pretty much all their movies. Sometimes realistic, sometimes not, but always pretty graphic. I don't know, maybe I'm just twisted, but I like their movies and they always seem to include this stuff. Obviously, that's not the only thing they have in common, and I would hope you wouldn't assume that that's the only reason that I like them. I'm just trying to give you a heads up on what you can expect if you want to see this movie based on my recommendation, as well as a frame of reference for what other movies I tend to enjoy. That said, I do wholeheartedly recommend this movie to anyone who wants a psychological horror experience that will keep you guessing and subvert your expectations about traditional genre tropes, deliver edge-of-your-seat suspense with some visceral and brutal violence, great performances by Sir Patrick Stewart, that chick from Arrested Development, and the late Anton Yelchin, all in this gorgeous and authentic punk rock aesthetic that I just frickin' love. Now that all that stuff's out of the way, here is my favorite example of a movie that assumes their audience isn't stupid. Green Room is about a punk rock band, the Ain't Rights, living the minimalist, DIY touring lifestyle. This is demonstrated right off the bat in the opening scene that shows the band's tour van in a cornfield after one of the members fell asleep driving. Yelchin and maybe Funke's natural reaction is to bike down the highway until they find other cars to siphon gas from. Nothing super groundbreaking as far as exposition goes, but in that first 3 minutes, we have an established group that is clearly shown a vagabond vagabond, poor, delinquent lifestyle, all with pretty minimal dialogue. But what I love about these few lines is how realistic they feel. Basically, all spoken lines in the first 3 minutes are sarcastic quips and the band members just being jerks to each other, because you'd probably come to expect that after being on the road for so long with people you're comfortable with. That and the quick discussion about the closest place that the gas siphoners are going to. And it's just the location. They don't say why they're going there. They don't have to. It would just be for the audience to hear it at that point, because this is a routine for them. And guess what? As a viewer, even though it's your first time seeing this movie, I bet you didn't need anyone to explain that to you. This movie's dialogue stays consistently grounded like this. The conversations almost feel voyeuristic in the sense that they feel like real people having real conversations that you're just eavesdropping on. Almost all exposition in this movie has to be inferred by the audience based on the context of the dialogue. This really starts to shine later on in the movie, so I'm going to start venturing into those potentially minor spoilers. The story really kicks off when the band stumbles onto a horrific act of violence. Because they are the only witnesses, they become targets of a terrifying gang of skinheads who want to make sure that all the evidence is eliminated. This act of violence is committed in the green room of a venue owned by these skinheads that the band is performing at, and subsequently where they end up being trapped for most of the movie and where it gets its title. The initial reaction of the band is probably what you'd expect, and also probably what anyone in their situation would do. They call the cops. One of the skinheads in charge, played by Macon Blair, quickly diffuses the suspicion by carrying out a plan that is never even talked about out loud. We just see him getting some cash, a couple neo-Nazi volunteers, and then we dive straight into watching how they actually handle the situation. Watching the scene play out is extremely suspenseful, because while the skinheads are executing their plan, you're not even really sure what they're doing, especially since the way they go about solving their problem is pretty disturbing. It's not until they start talking to the police that you can figure out what they're doing, at which point it becomes obvious and isn't needed to be explained. After seeing the steps that Macon Blair's character takes, you realize no one ever needed to say anything, let alone explain exactly what they were planning to do. An easier way to write this scene that wouldn't necessarily be terrible, but in my opinion definitely not as good, would be to have this character tell his accomplices what he needs them to do in order to get the police to leave. Going into the next scene, where the plan is executed, the audience would know what the neo-Nazis intend to do, but any of the suspense would come from us watching to see if it unfolds according to plan. I like this movie's version better, because having these characters just do it without talking about it is probably what they'd end up doing in real life, and it makes the viewer engage with what's going on. Leading up to this scene, I'm thinking, why are they doing that? What does he need the money for? Once we see the end of it, the plan is logical and simple enough that we can answer those questions for ourselves. Green Room's other big example of that same type of writing that reveals information through action and implication is in the motive behind the, quote, horrific act of violence. Over the course of the film, we find out more about the victim, the attacker, the people involved, the skinheads and their venue that this disaster takes place in, and towards the end, Patrick Stewart and Macon Blair have a moment where they figure out what really happened when they find a key piece of evidence. They never explicitly say anything, and they don't have to, because just like us, they're shown just enough information to come to their own conclusions. And honestly, that point is pretty inconsequential to the story overall. It's really just information that's there for you to pick up on if you're paying attention, but doesn't have any real impact over the events of the film. Just makes it a better story. These two scenes are examples of a movie not holding the audience's hand and over-explaining things that don't even really count as exposition. They're just realistic dialogue, or lack thereof, that asks the viewer to actively participate by thinking about what's going on in the scene. This adheres to the adage that you've probably heard before that a lot of filmmakers consider to be the golden rule of storytelling. Show, don't tell. Don't talk about what characters are capable of, demonstrate it. Don't have them explain out loud what they're feeling like a lunatic, show them displaying real emotion. Don't tell us about the world that your story takes place in, show it to us. A presentation, visual proof will always be more compelling than force-feeding us what you want us to know. So many movies, especially modern blockbusters, shy away from this type of writing out of fear for potentially not implying something heavily enough or not showing something convincing enough that would leave audiences missing something important. But I really hope that more studios start making these types of efforts that would probably be considered risks to them, because the payoff is having a more believable story. If you've made an entertaining movie, paying attention should be effortless on the viewer's part, and the average person is more than capable of picking up on what parts of a story are important. It's not easy to write a good screenplay. Nuanced and subtle exposition, hidden in seemingly normal conversations that feel real and authentically spoken by real people, would be in every movie if it was easy to write. But that's the standard worth striving for, because that's what ultimately provides the most immersive experience that we can suspend our disbelief through and helps us forget about our boring lives for a couple hours. Audiences don't need to be treated like they're stupid. We're smarter than you give us credit for, Hollywood.